Good evening, everybody. My name is Lenny DiLorenzo. I'm a member of the Institute for Church Life, the institute that is hosting our event tonight. And on behalf of the entire institute, I'd like to welcome you to the second night in our lecture series, Dante, Mercy, and the Beauty of the Human Person. This series, along with the invitation to read Dante's Commedia during the Lenten season and into Easter, is a response to Pope Francis's invitation to journey with Dante in the year of mercy, to, quote, rediscover the lost or obscured meaning of our human path, and to hope to see again the glowing horizon on which the dignity of the human person shines in its fullness. Those of us who had the pleasure of listening to our first two lecturers a couple of weeks ago, Professor Vittorio Montemaggi and Father Kevin Grove, have already sensed the sort of meaning this journey with Dante can bear. For those who are not able to join us, we invite you to enjoy these videos, the videos of these lectures online with links available on our series webpage. Our format tonight will be the same as each night in our series, which is that we will listen to our first lecturer, then take a 15-minute break before returning for the second lecture. The break will take the place of the typical question and answer period, so we invite you to use that break as an opportunity to enter into conversation with one another and also to talk with our speakers. So let's get started. And the first item of business is to introduce our first lecturer for tonight. John Cavadini is the McGrath-Cavadini Director of the Institute for Church Life and professor in the Department of Theology, where he also served as chair from 1997 to 2010. His decades of leadership and administration have brought with them countless hours of meetings, making him one of the university's resident experts on his topic tonight. Hell. He's at the forefront of the university's service to the church, for Professor Cavadini has served as a member of the Committee on Doctrine for the United States Catholic Bishops for the past 10 years, while also serving a 5-year term on the International Theological Commission, to which Pope Benedict XVI appointed him in 2009. Pope Benedict also made Professor Cavadini a member of the Pontifical Equestrian Order of St. Gregory in recognition of his distinguished service to the Church, which above all else means that the Swiss Guard is required to salute him. Even with his inestimable service to the Church, both through the Institute for Church Life and beyond, perhaps no one benefits more from John Cavadini than his students. Teaching courses at every level of theology, from undergraduates to doctoral students, and from master students preparing for further scholarship in the academy to those preparing for ministry in the church, Professor Cavadini is himself a master of granting accessibility to that which is most sublime, most beautiful, most important. And because my office is right next to his, and so I witnessed the weekly train of students awaiting office hours, I can personally attest to the fact that the education of each of his students, whether a college freshman or a 6th-year doctoral student, or a 10th-year doctoral student for that matter, is treated with the utmost seriousness and the utmost care. And if by chance you haven't come to know John Cavadini before in any of these ways or through his formal scholarship, perhaps you have come to know him of late through his newfound public pulpit, at John Cavadini on Twitter, from which have flowed such gems as these. Quote, why do sort of bad things happen to kind of good people? For example, why doesn't God help me write clever tweets on sports and politics? I received 2 retweets and 10 likes. Quote, the original theory of relativity, time is relative to love. 8 retweets, 12 likes. Or the original tweet, friends, I have materialized on Twitter. 3 retweets, 21 likes. Please join me in welcoming our first lecturer this evening, Professor Cavadini, who will speak on the kingdom of irony, Augustine, sin, and Dante's Inferno.
Thanks, Lenny, for that very generous introduction, though there might be a circle in hell for people who quote other people's tweets. I'm going to have to read the text more carefully. I also want to say that I feel a little bit humbled. I feel a little bit like in the position of a warm-up band, because I'm actually speaking in the presence of a real Dante scholar, that's Christian Moves. And so I just feel a little bit self-conscious. And he's a real thing. I'm an amateur. but I'm speaking in the spirit, I guess, of Pope Francis, hoping to offer a paper which maybe doesn't necessarily prove a thesis as much as I hope that it illuminates a kind of spiritual vision, which I hope is in the text, and which maybe can be of use in the journey of Lent that we're embarked on right now. I have to add that the Swiss Guard have never saluted me. And I also have to add that there must be a gym in hell somewhere. All the pictures seem to presuppose it. Can't be that bad then. Anyway, this paper tries to bring together my two favorite works of all time, The City of God and Dante's Inferno, and I am of the belief that while you're reading either one of those texts, nothing bad can happen to you. There we go. The prologue to Augustine's great work, The City of God, abounds in ironies that Augustine seems to relish and even to celebrate as he sets them before the reader's eyes. In the opening lines, he remarks, quote, "I know how great is the effort needed to convince the proud of the power and excellence of humility, an excellence which makes it soar above all the summits of this world, which sway in their temporal instability, overtopping them all with an eminence not arrogated by human pride, but granted by divine grace." The long and arduous City of God, that's Augustine's description of his work, famously begins by displaying the irony that humility, the virtue of accepting the lowliness of one's state in relationship to God, is said to soar and even to overtop. And it soars and overtops not just any old height, but all the summits of this world. That is, as Augustine explains, all the claims and achievements built on human pride. It is, Augustine says, hard to convince the proud of this reality, that there is any power or excellence in something that has been, by that very pride, relegated to a status that seems so lowly, so utterly insignificant, so completely unworthy of mention. That it seems to have no claim on reality. Ironically, the proud, who aspire to be at the summit of things, do not see the reality of the power and excellence of humility which overtops them. And in fact, they have contempt for it. Otherwise, it would not be so hard, so long and arduous a task to convince them. For the irony of humility overtopping pride, is actually an irony intrinsic to pride itself. Although, as Augustine puts it, pride swells in its attempt to arrogate to itself what is God's, and thereby lusts after domination of others, ironically, it cannot itself escape domination, as Augustine puts it, by that very lust for domination itself. He comments at the end of the prologue to the City of God that although his treatise is to be on the subject of the most glorious city of God, he must comment on another city. Quote, "Therefore I cannot refrain from speaking about the city of this world, a city which aims at dominion, which holds nations in enslavement, but is itself dominated by that very lust of domination. I must consider this city as far as the scheme of this work demands and as occasion serves," end quote. The irony of this passage is understated, but nevertheless it is present. The city of this world includes, as Augustine has already hinted, but will amply demonstrate later, it includes especially empires and those who run the empires, those who are at the summits of this world. These empires, as Augustine will tell the story later, dominate history, and in their attempt to dominate others, make themselves the center of attention. But Augustine relegates them all here to something that, ironically, you're going to get sick of that word, that ironically is not itself going to be visible in the course of except in the course of a treatment of a prior reality, that is the city of God. And this both in terms of the prologue's mention of them, city of God first, and then in terms of the history of the cosmos, because the most glorious city of God comes first. The ironies attaching to the city of this world are not an accident of Augustine's compositional strategy, but are irreducible to its identity. For it is a kind of identity that turns out to be no identity, a city that is not a city, a community that is no community. It can never be seen as itself, therefore, except by contrast with something that has its own solid identity, a true communion. In Book 14 of the City of God, Augustine famously comments on the two cities, quote, "This is assuredly the difference that sunders the two cities of which we are speaking. The one is a community of devout human beings, the other a company of the irreligious, and each has its own angels attached to it. In one city, love of God has been given first place. In the other, love of self," end quote. Later on, he comments, as he closes Book 14, quote, "We see then that the two cities were created by two kinds of love." These are famous passages, I'm sure you all remember them. The earthly city was created by self-love reaching to the point of contempt for God. The heavenly city, by the love of God, carried as far as contempt of self. Self-love reaching to the point of contempt of God is what Augustine calls pride. He comments, "What is pride except a longing for a perverse kind of exaltation? For it is a perverse kind of exaltation to abandon the basis on which the mind should be firmly fixed and to become, as it were, based on oneself, and so remain," end quote. The proud are called in Scripture, Augustine says, self-pleasers, sibi placentes, and they subscribe to the baseless fiction that they can make themselves happy, that they are self-sufficient for their own happiness. In other words, that they are their own supreme good. Though it seems like an exaltation, pride is a perverse exaltation. By aiming at more, Augustine wryly comments, a man is diminished when he elects to be self-sufficient and defects from the one who is really sufficient for him. The same goes for the communities the prideful create. The irony of a city whose very constitution is self-love is easily grasped. It is inherently not a community at all. The earthly city, Augustine comments, is generally divided against itself by litigation, by wars, by battles, by the pursuit of victories that bring death with them, or at best are doomed to death. For if any section of that city has risen up in war against another part, it seeks to be victorious over other nations, though it is itself the slave of base passions. And if, when victorious, it is exalted in its arrogance, that victory brings death in its train, end quote. Victories that are not really victorious, exaltations that are not really elevations, community that is no community, intrinsically centrifugal, and only by circumstance and violence centripetal. That is why this community, the city of this world, can only be seen by contrast with real community, because there is at bottom of this so-called city nothing but perversion, and that is to say, nothing at all. The irony of this city is irreducible. It can only be truly seen in the moment that its pretensions to community are unmasked. Augustine comments that, quote, when it is condemned to the final punishment, it will no longer be a city, end quote. For it never was truly a city, and could only be seen by contrast with what is truly a city. And yet it will not be annihilated, for that would imply there was something to annihilate in the first place. It is the moment of unmasking that will be permanent, for that is the only way this city can be seen, in its unmasking. One can take as a kind of synecdoche, the part for the whole, for this, Augustine's comment on the state of the damned. What Augustine highlights the most is the irony of their state. Exploiting the irony inherent in the language of the book of Revelation, he calls their state a second death. Because the soul cannot be said, quote, to be alive in that state when it is separated from the life of God, nor can the body when it is subjected to eternal torments. And this is precisely the reason why this second death will be harder to bear, because it cannot come to an end in death, end quote. Perhaps the ultimate irony. It is a death that is seen to be death precisely and ironically because it cannot end in death. It is a life that is continually unmasked as life. Quote, for in that final and everlasting punishment, we correctly talk of the death of the soul because it no longer derives life from God. But how can we talk in this case of the death of the body, since it is deriving life from the soul? For otherwise it cannot feel the bodily torments which are to follow the resurrection. Is it because life of any kind is a good thing, while pain is an evil, and for that reason the body cannot be said to be alive, when the purpose of the soul is not the body's life, but the body's pain? End quote. Pride is ultimately the commitment not to reality, but to a fiction. This comes out the most explicitly in Augustine's description of the pride of the first being to commit the sin of pride, the devil. Augustine, in these comments, is exegeting John 8:44. He, that is the devil, was a murderer from the beginning and did not stand in the truth. Augustine comments, he did not stand fast in the truth because he refused to be subject to his Creator, and in his arrogance supposed that he wielded power as his own private possession and rejoiced in that power. And thus he was both deceived and deceiving, because no one can escape the power of the omnipotent. He has refused to accept reality, and in his arrogant pride presumes to counterfeit an unreality, end quote. Or we could say a fiction, the fiction of his own self-sufficiency. The devil can only persuade people to follow him by lying, by presenting this unreality as a reality. The devil, Augustine says, is not only a liar, but he is the father of lies. And those who join him, his city, the city of this world, must continually dissemble. These dissemblings can be very persuasive. The angel of darkness can parade as an angel of light. Let us return one final time to the prologue of the city of God before finally turning to Dante, in order to grasp this point most fully. Here is how the city of God begins. Here, my dear Marcellinus, to whom the treatise is dedicated, is the fulfillment of my promise, a book in which I have taken upon myself the task of defending the glorious city of God against those who prefer their own gods to the founder of that city. I treat of it both as it exists in this world of time, a pilgrim among the ungodly, living by faith, and as it stands in the security of its everlasting seat. We have already seen how long and arduous a task this will be, because of the great effort needed to convince the proud of the excellence and strength of humility, that is, of reality. Since, as we have now seen, pride is an addiction to a counterfeit reality, a fiction, which is actually very good at concealing the fiction. How good? Augustine comments, still in the prologue, quote, "The king and founder of this city, which is our subject, the city of God, has revealed in the scripture of his people this statement of the divine law. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." That's James 4:6. This is God's prerogative, but man's arrogant spirit and its swelling pride has claimed it as its own, and delights to hear this verse quoted in its own praise, to spare the conquered and beat down the proud. You'll recognize the citation from the Aeneid. End quote. Pride swells by delighting to arrogate to itself what is God's prerogative, which is the gift of grace and mercy to those who are humbled by its conquest of them, of the prideful. The Roman Empire, here representing the city of this world, sets itself up as a kind of chimerical mirror image, an inverse enantiomer, for those who took organic chemistry, an inverse enantiomer of the city of God. Or rather, it is the text of Virgil's Aeneid which gives us the clue, which allows Augustine to make the city of this world temporarily visible as the city of this world, and in his, that is Augustine's text, represented by the Roman Empire. But here the empire is seen not on its own terms, but as a deceived and deceiving mimesis, using Virgil's text to achieve this analysis and this depiction, a point that Virgil's text could not have made on its own, and yet which Augustine could not make as effectively apart from this quotation from Rome's national epic, set up here as a kind of counterpart to Scripture, a kind of anti-Scripture, as Augustine counterpoises a verse from the Aeneid with a verse from Scripture. Virgil is a convenient, and I like to think not accidental, link here to move on to Inferno, finally. Though in many ways, one can feel that one is not leaving the city of God behind and moving on to Inferno. This is not only because Virgil appears in the first canto, just as he appears in the very first chapter of the city of God, and because functionally speaking, it is Virgil that will help Dante represent the city of this world, willingly, insofar as he is an element in the text of Dante and not read on his own. But also because Virgil identifies himself in this text in a way that immediately links him to the city of God, telling Dante that he lived in the time of the false and lying gods, a poetic quote of City of God 2.29. It is the Virgil of the city of God that identifies himself here. But that's not all, for Dante, just as much as Augustine, offers to our eyes and ears the same celebration of irony in abundance, relishing in its abundance, that meets the reader of the city of God and continues its presence throughout the city of God. And just as in the city of God, this irony is directly connected to the evocation of sin. The text of Inferno starts out as a perfectly respectable allegory. What, in fact, announces itself as a perfectly standard allegory, with standard allegorical furniture. The path of our life's journey, the dark wood of error, and emergence from it. The beams of the truth, itself unseen, just as the sun itself is unseen here. And the mountain of the soul's ascent to truth, which, if we hadn't gotten the message before Virgil appears, is characterized in Virgil's question to Dante the pilgrim, why doesn't he climb up it, as the mountain of delight, the origin and cause of every joy. which could not possibly be true of any literal mountain. That is the origin and cause of every joy. In response to Virgil's question as to why he doesn't climb the mountain, Dante points out the third of the three beasts that caused him to abandon hope of ever climbing up that mountain. Whatever particular sins the three beasts represent, I know the commentators argue about this, it is obviously an unholy trinity, such as the cares, phantasms, and concupiscence that block the mind's road to God in Bonaventure's Itinerarium, or the triple sin of 1 John 2:16 that structures the confessions of St. Augustine. Three hypostases of sin, consubstantial in the original essence of all sin, which is pride, while pride itself remains invisible because, if we are following Augustine, it is not an essence, but a kind of anti-essence, the absence of a good, just like all sin is. It is made visible, pride that is, rather as a kind of warping of the nice, friendly, moralistic allegory we thought we were all about to enjoy. It is the encounter with the unholy trinity of sin, and by implication with pride, which blocks the ascent and makes it necessary for Virgil to inform Dante that in order to go up, he must first, ironically, go down. His hope restored by Virgil's account of the gracious favor of heaven in the second canto, it is an irony that he begins his journey by passing under the sign that instructs him to abandon hope. As John Fricero pointed out years ago in The Poetics of Conversion, it is an irony that the text of the inscription over the gate of hell is read simultaneously by the fictional characters in the text, the pilgrim Dante and his guide Virgil, and the actual reader, you and me, of Dante's comedy. If you notice, it's not announced. It doesn't say, here was the inscription over the gate to hell. You just read it. And sometimes the good editors of our editions put it in all caps or something. But that's the kindness of the editor. I don't think Dante put it in all caps. You just read it and you don't know what it is. Sorry for that expostulation. At this point, fiction and reality coincide perfectly. Reality of the reader and of the fiction, ironically. And the allegory is, as it were, warped, so that somehow there is no longer a simple correspondence between obviously allegorical fictional elements and the realities to which they correspond. But rather there is a way in which the fiction is offered as a direct and immediate vision of a reality to which we would have no other access, because pride blocks our vision. Pride causes us to feel or to accept what is actually a lowering of ourselves as an exaltation of ourselves. It is, if we are to follow Augustine's guidance, an addiction to an illusion, to a fiction. Ironically then, the fictional depiction of the punishment of sins in the Inferno offers an antidote to this addiction, as the reader is invited to contemplate fearsome images of the sins themselves, shorn of the illusions that pride tenders to us. I would suggest that the Augustinian character of this literary strategy is visible from the punishment depicted in the very first circle, Virgil's own circle, where Virgil describes the punishment this way, quote, "We are now lost and punished just with this, that we have no hope, and yet we live in longing," end quote. The shades whose portrait Dante paints most, he focuses on in the first circle, are those of the so-called virtuous pagans, and their features are described in ways that evoke the classical ideal, Stoic in origin, of apatheia, or passionlessness. In aspect, Dante says, they were neither sad nor joyous. Their eyes were both grave and slow, and therefore carrying great authority. The gathering of poets, philosophers, and virtuous rulers and warriors represents the best of the classical world. And yet, the neither sad nor joyous gathering of these great-hearted souls has something artificial about it. In fact, they're in hell. They're on the other side of the evil river, as Cato will say of his wife Marcia in the Purgatorio. They're not in a true limbo, a neutral space. They're damned, part of the blind world whose denizens have no self-perspective. The seemingly virtuous citizens of the first circle are not sad, but they should be sad, as they have lost everything. In the city of God, Augustine reserves some of his choicest and harshest language for his analysis of the so-called virtue of apatheia, which he names as such in City of God 14, chapter 10. Quote, "If the earthly city has any citizens who give an appearance of controlling and in some way checking the emotions, they are so arrogant and pretentious in their irreligion that the swelling of their pride increases in exact proportion as their feeling of pain decreases. Some of these people may display an empty complacency, the more monstrous for being so rare, which makes them so charmed with this achievement in themselves that they are not stirred by any emotions at all, not swayed or influenced by any feelings. If so, they rather lose every shred of humanity than achieve a true tranquility. For hardness does not necessarily imply rectitude, and insensibility is not a guarantee of health," end quote. Dante's depiction of the virtue of apatheia as infernal, indeed as its own punishment, recalls passages such as this from the City of God. It is, in a sense, the depiction of apatheia here, the depiction of pride at its purest, like 200 proof pride. Completely transparent, like absolute vodka. Absolute pride. That's not in my paper, but it is, in a sense, the depiction of pride at its purest. Original sin unmixed with any actual sin, and therefore presented without distraction for the reader. The prideful are depicted as dispassionately bearing the eternal loss of God, fully committed to the fiction that they are their own final good. Only God can truly bear the loss of God, and yet even he cried on our behalf when he was abandoned by his Father on the cross. And the comparison is apt, because the emotions of Christ are given as a contrast to the pseudo-virtue of apatheia in the very same chapter of the City of God. But it is hard to convince the proud of the power and excellence of humility. And since that's true, the reader, who perhaps is attached to the great-heartedness of these heroes, even when it is seen as an infernal greatness. And so we descend into the second circle of hell, where not only unexpiated original sin, but actual sin begins to be punished. In the second circle, the lustful are punished with a tempestuous wind, as you've all read, which, quote, bellows like the sea when it is battered by opposing winds, end quote. Quote, the hellish hurricane, which never rests, drives on the spirits with its violence, wheeling and pounding, it harasses them. Those, that is, who are, another quote, damned because they sinned within the flesh, subjecting reason to the rule of lust, end quote. In Dante's depiction of the second circle's punishment, it is easy to see it as a depiction of the sin itself. It's one of the easiest figures, I think, in the whole allegory. And if it were not obvious enough, the Virgil in Dante's text, as did Augustine's Virgil in Augustine's text, gives the clue that enables one to see reality, not only through the fictional depiction of the punishment, but through the fiction that lust creates around itself, and so blocks a true understanding of what a hellish thing it actually is. Virgil instructs Dante to speak to Paolo and Francesca by telling him to appeal to, quote, that love which impels them, end quote. There's the clue. A description at one and the same time of the lust which glues Paolo and Francesca together for all eternity, and of the hellish hurricane which impels them. This helps us understand that the utter, but for all that not innocent, poignancy of Francesca's story. Love, she says, that can quickly seize the gentle heart, took hold of him, speaking of Paolo, because of the fair body taken from me. Love that releases no beloved from loving, took hold of me so strongly through his beauty, that as you can see, it has not left me yet, end quote. The violent language and the metaphors mirrors the violence of the wind that will not release them. And yet the irony is, and it's a poignant irony, is that Francesca does not see it. To make matters worse, Dante himself buys into the confusing use of language, end quote. Alas, how many gentle thoughts, how deep a longing had led them to the agonizing pass. He says, and then tells Francesca, quote, that her afflictions move him to tears of sorrow and pity. He asks her to tell him, in the time of gentle sighs, with what and in what way did love allow her to recognize her still uncertain longings, end quote. It is clear that the pilgrim Dante buys into Francesca's self-delusion, and that not even he sees the irony that her words describing her love do not depict something gentle, but something that describes at once the violence of the punishment of the sin and the sin. Perhaps it is a dim awareness of the closeness of the illusion and the reality, the efficacious deceptiveness of the mimesis of pride that causes Dante to faint, as if I had met my death at the end of the visit to the second circle. But hopefully the reader is beginning to acquire better vision, or at least a hermeneutic of suspicion towards the self-justifying rhetoric of the prideful, that is, of themselves. For who could not recognize in the rhetoric of Francesca their own justification of lustful feelings with the mystique of the language of romantic love? It's that close to the illusion. In the interest of time, we must take our leave of upper hell, where the sins of incontinence are depicted through the depiction of their punishments, and follow the pilgrim Dante into lower hell, where the sins of malice are depicted in the punishments we see. Lower hell is styled as a city, the city of Dis, thus recalling Augustine's characterization of the community of the prideful as a city, the city of this world, the community that is no community, the one that can be made visible only in its unmasking. In the city of Dis, we again encounter an abundance of ironies, not the least of which is, perhaps, the placement of some of the sins, lower or higher than we might have expected, at least than I expected. For example, the sin of flattery is punished in the 8th circle, while the sin of tyrannous killing is punished in the 7th circle, and in the first ring of the circle at that. True, it is probably no picnic to be immersed in a stream of boiling blood, and one may imagine that it is a worse punishment subjectively than to be plunged into excrement, as the flatterers are. But still, flattery is punished lower in the Inferno. Hypocrisy, too, would seem to be a sin, not as great as violence against the neighbor. But it, too, along with counterfeiting, is lower than violence. I would like to suggest that this is because the lower you get in Dante's hell, the closer you get to the act of lying, which is constitutive of the city of this world, which persuades people to join up, and which creates the community that is no community. Fraud, punished in the 8th circle, and betrayal, the most serious form of fraud, punished in the 9th circle, is a sin of representation, of communication, of deliberate illusion. There is no circle that punishes liars, tout court, because the whole of hell is founded on a lie, namely that pride will exalt you, and the fraudulent are those who have most predicated their identity on this lie. Some of the most horrifying images in the Inferno come from the 8th and 9th circles, because here, the beauty of the human person, to quote our theme, made in the image of God, and the good of human solidarity, intended by God from the beginning, is shown as disfigured and marred by its commitment to pride under the guise of fraud. Pride, in the Augustinian sense, the idea that one can pass oneself off as one's own final good, as completely self-sufficient, is the ultimate fraud. Not only does it disfigure the human person, but it creates a city that is dark, that stinks to high heaven. Fraud batters not just individual people, but the social bonds between them, which are turned to shit by flattery and turned to darkness by bribery. The grafters, one of the demons guarding them says, quote, will for cash change a no to a yes, end quote. And so immerse themselves in a society that is like a sticky mass of pitch, the bonds among people reduced to a kind of substantial darkness, as thick as the darkness of the 9th plague of Egypt. In one of the scenes of comic relief in Inferno, a grafter from Navarre, which we would have just read if we're following, a couple of days ago. A grafter from Navarre bribes one of the demons with the promise of other sinners that he'll be able to torture. Ironically, so that he can slip back under the pitch. This guy is performing the sin for which he is damned, and in the process showing us that the punishment of the sin is the sin itself. For there is only darkness left when truth becomes a function of cash. The sinner looks like an otter when he is originally caught by the demon guard on his pitchfork. I like the circle because it's the only place where you have demons with pitchforks. The sinner looks like an otter when he is originally caught by the demon guard, his human form diminished by his fraud, just as the image of God, quote unquote, is defaced by the fraud of divination, to the point where Dante weeps to see it so disfigured in the 4th circle, the 4th pouch of the 8th circle. The irony of the pride of the sin of divination can be seen in the depiction of the sin. You'll remember that the punishment is that the head of the sinner is stuck on backwards. Is your head put on right? No. The irony of the pride of the sin of divination can be seen in the depiction of the sin. One hardly becomes more godlike, but rather less human. One distorts one's own humanity so that one walks backwards, imagining he's walking forwards. What does a society of thieves look like? We find out in the 5th pouch of the 8th circle. It looks like a pit of snakes, if you see it truly. Deprived of the perverse mimesis that pride would make of it. Being the master of other people's goods seems to elevate you. But in reality, in clasping the fraud that is pride to yourself, you are making yourself one body with a serpent, and thereby losing your human form altogether. Dante apostrophizes the reader to emphasize what I think is the most horrific scene. If, reader, you are slow now to believe what I shall tell, that's no cause for wonder, for I who saw it can hardly accept it. As I kept my eyes fixed upon those sinners, a serpent with 6 feet springs out against one of the 3 sinners present and clutches him completely. It gripped his belly with its middle feet, and with its 4 feet grappled his 2 arms, and then it sank its teeth in both cheeks. It stretched its rear feet out along his thighs and ran its tail along between the 2. Then straightened it again behind his loins. No ivy ever gripped a tree so fast as when that horrifying monster clasped and intertwined the other's limbs with its. Then, just as if their substance were warm wax, they stuck together and they mixed their colors, so neither seemed what he had seemed before, what he had been before. End quote. To commit the sin of thieving fraud is to echo the primal sin of pride as an attempt to steal from God. And it is like making yourself available for sex with a serpent, because you had to see the sexual connotations of that scene. Like making yourself available for sex with a serpent, so that you become one flesh with the serpent. The horror of the image is that it is also an image of the society that is formed by the prideful, a perverse image of the communion between Christ and his bride, the church. Just as the sin of simony, earlier in the text, the buying and selling of the Holy Spirit as though God were a commodity, is imaged as an inversion of the mystery of Pentecost, with the flames of the Holy Spirit, who cannot be bought, dancing on the feet of the sinner, whose form is distorted by being turned upside down, a position that prohibits any true social interaction, but pushes the sinner ever downward instead. Instead, as he had hoped, of being pushed ever upward in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It is in the ninth circle, though, that we get the most compelling, if also the most horrifying, I guess I said that several times, but the really most horrifying depiction of the city of this world, the community that is no community, where the sin of betrayal has turned the bonds of human communion into ice that freezes each off from the other, an image of the way in which the sin of pride, as the commitment to the fiction of being one's own self-sufficient good, is intrinsically fragmenting and can never create true communion, despite the illusions that the attempts to create communion by the empires that lust for domination build up. For this is the circle of the emperor of the despondent kingdom, the ultimate betrayer, Lucifer, whose pride has frozen the warmth of fellow feeling in all of the citizens of his empire. Dante's depiction of the punishment of the sin is an analysis and depiction of the sin, a depiction of the city of this world by unmasking the city of this world, by showing it as a communion that is no communion, as a peace that is no peace. The sacrament of this anti-communion, its bestial sign, is the image of the cannibalism of Count Ugolino. You are to know, Ugolino tells Dante, I was Count Ugolino, and this one here, whose neck he's eating, if you remember, Archbishop Ruggieri. And now I'll tell you why I am his neighbor. There could be no more ironic evocation of the word neighbor than this one. Love thy neighbor? No thanks. I prefer to eat my neighbor. To return to John Fricero, I accept his interpretation of this bestial sign, that it is an inverse image of the Eucharist. Perhaps the most infernal thing one can imagine. It is the sacrament not of communion, but of cannibalism. And in the image of eternal cannibalism, we see the truth of the city of this world, where neighbors are no neighbors, where communion is no communion, the city that is no city, but dog eat dog, as it were. Oddly enough, the farther we get to the bottom of things, the more familiar they become. Who isn't familiar with a society that has horrifyingly become a city of snakes, where one can trust no one, where nothing can be taken at face value, where even the most sacred bonds, the bonds of kinship and friendship, can be and are routinely betrayed? Who does not recognize this mass of evils, that's a quote from Augustine, that even perverts friendship? And now this is a quote from Augustine. The bitter fear that the friendship of our friends can be changed into treachery, malice, and baseness. And when such things do happen, and the more numerous our friends, the more often they happen, and the news is brought to our ears, who, except one who has this experience, can be aware of the burning sorrow that ravages our hearts? Certainly we would rather hear that our friend were dead, although this also we could not hear without grief." End quote. This passage from the City of God, Book 19, where Augustine is once again taking up his rhetorical cudgel against the idea of apatheia, shows us just how familiar the ninth circle of hell is to us, if we are honest, and have not tried to cultivate the apatheia that is only one more prideful illusion. But in the ninth circle, Dante reveals this familiar scene that we're all familiar with from just looking around us. Reveals this familiar scene for what it is, an inversion of the communion of which the Eucharist is the efficacious sign. And that is the reason we can see it for what it is, in the light afforded by the perspective of the Eucharist, of which the city of this world is the prideful perversion. Because there is the Eucharist, we can just afford to look at this earthly city all around us without the sugar-coated, rose-colored blandishments of pride, and yet not despair, and not abandon all hope, not get caught, and thus, ultimately, take our leave of so much evil. For even as the banner of the King of Hell approaches, as the first verse quoted in Latin of the last canto, describing the entry into the bottom ring of the ninth circle says, this inversion of the traditional Good Friday hymn, announcing the veneration of the cross, invites us to be on the lookout for the cross. Somehow, and ironically, even in this infernal world. Funny how the hair of the devil's body, frozen in the ice, serves the pilgrim and his guide as a way out of hell, a way to climb down to the center of the earth, and then, ironically, as a ladder, as so many steps or stairs which permit one to ascend. And that step and stair language comes classically from the literature of spiritual ascent. The body of the devil frozen in the ice, able as emperor to create only a community that is no community, and to rule with his freedom immobilized, is the image of the cross, because it is the image of the triumph of Christ, of his self-emptying love, which caused him to mix himself into this world of sin and sinners, to experience all of the desolation and horror that we experience in this fallen world, and thus to find the hidden road out of it. His own love, not represented directly in hell, because in fact it is hidden in this world, as Augustine says in Book 16 of the City of God, in the shadows cast by empires, by the lust for domination, by the proud, which it is so difficult to convince of the power and excellence of humility. The cross is represented in the ability of the reader to see the whole of this evil and its illusions as somehow a whole, as a reality, which nevertheless can only be depicted in its unmasking as a reality, in the revelation that the devil is a liar and the father of lies. The lie, to wit, that love is not real, and that only power is, that humility is self-defeating and that pride elevates. The lie that there is no way out and that you will be trapped here forever, that in your desolation you are truly alone, that there is no one who cares or who can help you. By clinging to the cross, the victory of Christ, you will always see through this lie. It turns out that the joke is on the devil, and the ultimate irony is not a function of pride, but of love. It is the power and excellence of the humility of Christ's love that ironically exposed the powerlessness of the supposed strong man, who cannot keep anyone in hell who clings to this irony and so sees the way out. Such a person will emerge to see, with repristinated vision, the things of beauty that heaven bears, all of creation from the perspective of the love that created it. Such a person will emerge to see, once more, and maybe now, for the first time truly, the stars. Thank you.